Okay, so hey, welcome back. Thank you for doing this again. Today, as you know, we've been doing chapter 6, 7, 8, 9. We've done a little in chapter 5. We're going to end a little in chapter 10. We've done chapter 6. We've done probably finished chapter 7. And we started chapter 8. Today is chapter 8. In fact, we're going to have some fun in chapter 8. But let me give you a little background again on Hebrews, written 50 to 70 years after Christ was his death and resurrection, written for first century Christians who have a Jewish heritage. They no longer live in Jerusalem. They are discouraged and they are being persecuted by the Romans. They find that it might be easier just to be secular Jews, living this hybrid life of a Christian, but still going to the synagogue. And it's because it could save their lives to remain Jewish in this world where Christians are being persecuted. And they are discouraged because Christ has been gone and they just don't have that sense that Christ is present. And so they're discouraged. And the author of Hebrews has written this whole letter to encourage them, to say Christ is sufficient. So the gist of this is Jesus is better. Christ is supreme and completely sufficient for salvation. He's the perfect revelation and reflection of God, the complete sacrifice for sin. He is compassionate and understanding. He mediates for us. He is the way to eternal life. And finally, in one sentence, Christ is my only security in a changing world. That's important to me because our world is constantly changing. If you don't believe it, just read any history book about how it's changed in the last 15 years. In fact, I told my grandkids recently to use the pound sign, and they didn't know what that was. And I said, it's the thing, and they said, oh, a hashtag. So I roll my eyes at my grandkids. The last video we ended by reading chapter 8, verse 1, which says this. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Let me tell you this. I just finished reading a book called The 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. Now, I love Jordan Peterson. He's clinically super smart, but I'm torn because he confuses me about his religious beliefs. I want to believe he's a believer. I want him to be a Christian. I don't even, but when you read his books, when you read his writing, when you listen to him talk, at one moment you would think he's an atheist because of the way he says things. The next moment you think, well, maybe he's an agnostic. Maybe maybe he's one of those. And other times you read his writings and you think, well, this guy's a Christian. He's a believer. I don't know which he is, but let me tell you 3 rules out of his 12 rules. One is never let your children do anything that will make you dislike them. I love that rule. So don't let your kids run around a restaurant screaming and turning over chairs and bumping into other people, because if they weren't your kids, you would not like them. And so I like that. Don't let your kids do anything that would make you dislike them. One of the other rules is assume the person you are listening to might know something that you don't. I like that. He says everyone knows something that you don't know, and you probably know something that they don't know. So just assume they know something that you don't know. Be precise in your speech. Now, this is one of my favorites, because please take the trash out by 8 a.m. tomorrow is very precise. That is different than the trash sure looks full. Be precise in your speech. I love his rules, but let me tell you, I have rules. Do you have rules? I have rules. Here are my rules. Love the Lord, love people. A simple rule. Seems like it's a biblical rule. Another rule is one that I've learned from studying Judaism. It goes like this. Assume best intentions. The example is you don't even get invited to someone's wedding. You could assume the host hates your guts, but that's not assuming the best in the host or hostess, right? The easier, better way is assume best intention. Assume they had very good reasons for not inviting you. Okay, then they're off the hook. Assume perhaps they could only invite 20 people and there were 20 family members, therefore they couldn't invite you. Assume you were invited and your invitation was lost in the mail. Assume anything that you have to in order to make them out okay. Give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that people do this for you too, because you are going to one day be misunderstood. People will assume the worst in you. Even people who know you best may assume the worst. Why wouldn't they give you the benefit of the doubt? Which leads me to the next thing. One of my rules is give people the benefit of the doubt. Everyone can have a bad day, including you and me. So why not just assume when someone growls at you that they just are having a bad day? The dog had to be taken in for surgery and you didn't know it and they growled at you. Another rule, give people a second chance. Everyone makes mistakes, so give people a second chance and hope and pray they will give you a second chance when you make a mistake. And finally, one of my final rules, Give people a graceful exit whenever you can. An example, in my business, we draft people's bank accounts on a regular basis. It happens. Sometimes we get a response back saying non-sufficient funds. Now, we could assume that these people just don't manage their money well, and when they call us and say, hey, what's going on? We could say, hey, stupid, manage your money better. That's not very kind to begin with. It's not loving people. And the easier way is to give them a graceful exit. And you can say, this is not unusual. Many people deposit their checks after 2 p.m. on Friday, and we know the bank's cutoff point for deposits is 2 p.m. Perhaps we should move your draft to Monday instead of Friday, giving you more time to get your deposit into the bank, because we know it's the bank's fault, not yours. You give them a graceful exit. Now they know they just don't manage their money well. Give them a graceful exit anytime that you can to help people avoid embarrassment. Doesn't that make good sense? It's so easy. All these are about showing love, mercy, and compassion to others. Today's lesson out of chapter 8 yields a new lesson I'm adding to my list. So last week, the author told us about this priest and about the priesthood, about new criteria, the criteria required for this priest. In chapter 7, that criteria is made really clear. I'm going to start back in chapter 7, work us in chapter 8. Chapter 7, verses 26 and 27, this is from the NIV, says, such a high priest truly meets our needs, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from us sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. So what's the criteria for this new priest, which is Jesus Christ in the order of Melchizedek? What's the criteria? First, holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above heaven. Criteria 1, pretty straightforward. He doesn't need to offer sacrifice for himself because he doesn't sin. He offers once a single sacrifice, his death, once and for all, and that's it, no additional sacrifice. So, all right. For the rest of this lesson, assume you are the people the letter of Hebrews is written to. You are first century Christians, and therefore your ears are tuned to this as a first century Christian of Jewish heritage. And you live in a place and time where priests and sacrifices are well known. In fact, you live next door to the rabbi. You live next door to the priest. And he serves in the temple. You hear him yelling at his kids. You hear him curse when he hits his thumb with a hammer. And you know that he drinks just a little bit too much wine on special occasions. Now, you heard this criteria that we just talked about. And you know your priest, and you think, just like Scrooge, humbug. Because based on the priest you know, there is no priest that could meet that criteria. And by the way, as a first century Christian, you don't follow priests anymore anyway, so why do you care? So the only thing concerning you is that earlier in the letter, as you remember, the author said something to you that has you still kind of taken aback. He said, it's hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. So you're pausing at this point. You're thinking, I think he's saying something. I may need to try to understand this. So now I'm gonna ask him some questions because maybe he's talking about me. So here's the question that we as first century Christians are going to ask the author of the letter, assuming that we could get to him. Hey, author, is there anyone who could be that perfect and become that priest? Our author is very kind to us and says, certainly. Let's read chapter 7, verse 28. For the law appoints as high priests men all in their weaknesses, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son, Jesus Christ, who has been made perfect. He tells us there's a high priest. He makes it clear. So those of us who quit trying to understand we're now trying. And he continues because he knows we're still so thick-headed. He says, let me help you understand even more. This is where we get to chapter 8. Now the main point of what we are saying is this. Pause for effect. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. So this author keeps going. He says every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at the sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. So I'm first century Christian. I'm listening to this. I'm going, okay, now wait a minute. This Jesus is superior. His covenant is superior to the old covenant and those old promises. So what was or is the purpose of the priest anyway then? Because that's kind of confusing. Well, it's clear. And he, again, I love our author. He tells us, he says, I know you're confused. Let me help you. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 7 says this. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary, which we just heard the earthly sanctuary is a copy of the sanctuary in heaven. A tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. I have no idea why not, maybe time. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people, the sins the people had committed in ignorance. So again, I'm thinking, okay, that makes sense. I've kind of got it now. You're telling me that there's an earthly tabernacle. It's patterned after a tabernacle in heaven, and the priests on earth do this thing. They sacrifice, atone for sin, and I'm still confused. Why even have priests at all? And the answer is really clear. They intercede, as we just read, on our behalf before God, because we're not allowed to approach God if we're Jewish. And if you only have a high priest who goes into the Holy of Holies once a year, only he can approach God. But we've read recently that we too now, chapter 4, verse 14, we too now can approach the throne of God. So where did they do their service? Where did the high priest do their service? In the tabernacle, right? In the sanctuary. Who built the first tabernacle? Just heard Moses did. What was the blueprint? That was given to him by God. That was a copy and shadow of what's in heaven. So it leads us to this question, and this is a question that many people ask. Commentators answer this question. The question is there a tabernacle, a sanctuary, a holy of holies in heaven? And curious. Yes, no? What do you think?
Hebrews
Seems to say so, right? Except the commentaries don't. So here's where I have the ability to read the Bible for myself and make my own decisions. Most commentaries that you read say there is no tabernacle or sanctuary in heaven, and that this scripture is not about a physical place. Yet, when I read the Bible, we have a verse where God speaks to me, to my heart, using English language, which has been translated. I get that. But if we go back to the Hebrew, go back to study the original text, God speaks to us and tells us specifically that the earthly tabernacle is made on a copy of one in heaven. So a commentator who is a human being who studied the Bible interprets this different than I do, and I simply am going to disagree. I think there is a tabernacle in heaven, and I think one day I'm going to get to see it, and I'm going to walk in there, and I'm going to be able to approach the throne of God with boldness and walk up and say, I'm here, and Jesus Christ, my bloodline, has invited me in, and he's atoned for my sins, and I'm white as snow, and hey, God. Now, I know that seems very sacrilegious not to be, because God is God, but I love the idea that he is also Abba Father. So I should be able to walk up and climb up in his lap and say, Dad. So I look forward to that day. Okay, final question. What does chapter 8, verse 6 mean when it states, but in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. It's really saying two things, two factual things. One, that this is there is a superior ministry of Jesus when compared to earthly priests. His high priesthood is superior to them. Again, go back to Hebrews 1 all the way up. It's Jesus is superior to the angels. He's superior to Moses. He's superior to the elders. He's superior to the patriarchs and to the prophets. And so Jesus' ministry is superior. The second thing is that the New Testament covenant is superior to the promises that were told to Abraham, which were promises about land and generations. Ours is about eternal life. And that's why it's a superior covenant. Chapter 8, verse 7 gives us a reason, by the way. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. The problem wasn't with the covenant itself, it was with the people. They couldn't live up to what the covenant expected of them. In fact, I think they didn't have a heart for it. In some cases, they even turned their back upon God. What was it they were supposed to do that they couldn't do? Because they were obligations of the law. They couldn't follow the law. They couldn't be obedient. They couldn't love God. In fact, the first commandment is love God and don't put any other gods before him, right? I mean, that's sort of I think it's actually first 1 or 2 or 3 in there. And so they not only couldn't follow the law, they couldn't even follow the first commandment because they were constantly putting other gods before God. Okay, go back to this idea. You're a first century Christian. You want to ask more questions, so here you are. Okay, but I have more questions. And the author says, oops, just ran out of time. We'll pick back up on the next session, let you ask more questions. No, wait, you told me that there's a new rule that this lesson created for you. What's the new rule? And he smiles and goes, next week. End of lesson.